Moving along here, next we have David Benjamin Sherry. David Benjamin Sherry is a contemporary American photographer, best known for his colorful landscape photographs. His work revolves around interest in environmentalism, queer identity, and alternative film processes. Sherry has referred to himself as a nostalgic futurist. So, David Benjamin Sherry here, images look like this. Okay, so maybe this looks familiar to you, maybe it doesn't. But if you think back to where we started our lecture with Ansel Adams, David Benjamin Sherry is definitely riffing off of that particular tradition. So this image here is from a series called American Monuments. And American Monuments is a photographic series examining our relationship to landscape, climate change, color, queer identity, and historical photography, using monochrome depictions of the American national monuments being targeted by the Trump administration for immediate development in the interest of oil, coal, and uranium exploration. Okay, so not only is Sherry kind of directly referencing Ansel Adams with similar compositions, but he's kind of carrying on that tradition of environmentalism through his images, but updating them to speak to the contemporary issues facing us and also these places today. Okay. Um, so again, to give you reference to Ansel Adams, right? So these images are kind of a direct reference to each other. But he also is showing you some other images as well, okay? So this here is Double Dunes, Death Valley National Park, California, 2020. And I'll read something that he has written about his work. As a queer person, I continually ask myself what it means to venture into the wilderness, doing a job that has traditionally had a macho heterosexual identity attached to it. I am constantly made aware of my outsider perspective in the largely heteronormative spaces of rural America. Historically, going out into the wilderness has been a means of shedding of social constraints, but that freedom has been reserved for straight white men who wish to strengthen and solidify their credentials as the quote-unquote rugged individual. My presence in the wilderness is, in a sense, a performance of queering these places, which I have found liberating and empowering, and I seek to convey this spirit in my photographs. So I think the intentionality of using these like kind of brightly pasteled colors is definitely like the most obvious strategy he's using with the idea of queering the images or queering the landscape. So here we have a couple more images from him. And here, just to kind of like make it feel familiar, this is Kalalau Valley on Kauai. So moving along, we're going to bring it specifically to Hawaii. I'm going to show you the work of the collective. I'm going to show you the work of the collective Pili Ma'o. This is work by Mark Hamasaki and Kapolani Landgraf. Okay. So they began work together in 1989 and they're still working today. Deeply rooted in the particularities of place, Hamasaki and Landgraf have collaboratively documented transformations across the ahupua'a of Ko'olapoko on the island of Oahu for over 30 years, including the water struggles of Waiahole, Interstate H3 in Kaneohe, and the modernization of Kailua. Piliamo'o's visceral project E Luku Wale E devastation upon devastation, 1997 to present, makes visible the terminal stages of the construction of H3 highway and its destruction on cultural, agricultural, historical, and environmental sites of significance. Okay. So again, working within the landscape tradition of documenting out in the wilderness, this one has a very particularly pointed subject matter, namely the H3's construction on the island of Oahu. Okay, so some of you may be aware of this highway. Some of you might use it on a daily basis. But to give you a bit more context, H3 opened to Oahu's motoring public in December 1997 after decades of controversy and resilience. As a part of the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, the scenic roadway received over $1 billion in federal funds to link what are known as the Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam on the island's leeward side and the Kaneohe Marine Corps Base on the windward side. Championed by U.S. Senator Daniel K. Inouye, the project was eventually exempted from environmental laws as a rider on a 1986 appropriations bill, allowing it to cut through the rural valley of North Halawa and Haiku. So I think with this work, if you're driving on the H3, you're probably just thinking about how pristine it is, and it is quite lovely. But I think it makes you think about what actually happened to the landscape when this highway was constructed. Take you through these images, and I think a lot of them really speak for themselves. These are all done with 4x5 large format cameras, all done in black and white. So this is made in 1990. What you're looking at here is on the left-hand side, kind of the burrowing into the Ko'ola mountain range. On the right-hand side, you're seeing the pavement of a road leading up to the Ko'olaus. I think what's really interesting about this project is not only are they calling attention to the destruction of the landscape in order to build this highway, but there's also a little bit of nuance there and a little bit of discovery. Halawa Valley is largely considered to be sacred land. But as they were constructing the landscape, they started to uncover all these heiaus and sacred places that were thought to be destroyed or weren't present anymore. So there was a sense of discovery that happened too in the making of H3. So as much as it is a violent act against the landscape, there is, I don't want to say a benefit to it, but there was other things that came out of it. And actually, at the time of this lecture that I'm recording it, this work is up at the Hawaii State Art Museum as a continuation of the 2022 triennial that happened here earlier this year. So if you want to see this work in person, you can go check that out before the end of the year. I think this body of work is really important, not only within the broader context of the art world, but for us here at home in Hawaii when we're thinking about just how our land is used, right? We have a scarcity of land here. And I think that we have to be intentional about how that land is used. So moving on, we have Louis Hine. And just as we saw in the work of Pili'a Mo'o, Louis Hine is particularly concerned with the social side of photography, or I should say, how photography can be used to bring to light these particular social issues. So a little bit about Hine. he was trained as an educator in Chicago and New York. A project photographing on Ellis Island with students from the Ethical Cultural School in New York galvanized his recognition of the value of documentary photography in education. Soon after, he became a sociological photographer, establishing a studio in upstate New York. And so this idea of sociological photography, I think, is a really important thing to remember about Hine's work. And so what he did was he turned his camera towards these factories. And in these factories, they were using children for labor, which seems to be an appalling thing to do in today's world. But believe it or not, when he's making these pictures, it's a completely common practice. And Hine, seeing this and seeing what happened to these children that were working in these factories, was not happy with this decision to use child labor. Okay, so what he did was he would go into these factories and make pictures of these children working, not only of them working, but their working conditions, and the things that were happening to them, and brought that out into the public, which you can maybe guess these factories were not happy about what he was doing. Okay. So you can see here, these are children working with like some pretty heavy machinery, right? A lot of these children would go on to suffer, pretty horrific injuries in the face of making these products. And so Hine, by exposing the world to these images, he was bringing light to them, and ultimately he was able to bring about change with the passing of the Keats-Owen Act in 1916 that would set tighter standards for child employment throughout the United States. So I'll take you through some of these images just so you can see some of the things these children are going through. This particular picture with this child holding this bucket on their shoulder with this grimace in the face, I think is like a pretty apt representation of what was going on at the time. You can see on the left-hand side here, this girl doesn't have any shoes on. Her feet are quite filthy. She looks overworked. She looks kind of ragged and rugged. This boy on the right-hand side here who's carrying a bag of cotton that's probably bigger than him. So it got to the point where Hine was making these pictures and the factory workers were catching on to what he was doing. So he had to go in and act like he was somebody else. He had to put on a disguise in order to get access, and then he would start making the pictures without the factory knowing. So I think this is a good example of like how photographs have the ability to bring about consciousness, and in this case bring about change. Now, whether that is able to happen today is another question, right? You think about all the political and social issues that are at the forefront of not only the American consciousness but the global consciousness. I'm not sure if photographs are able to change anything these days. Okay, so I mean, I think it's something worth thinking about when we're talking about the function of photography these days, or the power of photography. So next we have the work of Hans Haacke, and he's not a photographer per se, but with this particular body of work I'm going to show you, he is using photographs. But again, keep in mind this idea of place, land, and space. So just to give you some background on Haacke, so he's an influential German-born American conceptual artist whose work critiques social and political systems, especially those found in the art world, Working across painting, installation, and photography, he tackles the influence of corporate interests on contemporary art. Hake often uses institutions both as subject matter and as a venue, which has at times caused controversy, most notably as seen in his proposed 1974 solo show at the S.R. Solomon Guggenheim Museum. So this project is considered a landmark project within institutional critique. The title of it is Sapolsky et al. Manhattan Real Estate Holdings, a real-time social system as of 1971, chronicles the fraudulent activities of one of New York's largest slumlords over the course of 2 decades. The work comprises of 146 photographs of Manhattan apartment buildings, maps of Harlem and the Lower East Side, photographs and charts documenting the real estate transactions, and text with information about the locations, ownership structures, and financial histories of the buildings. Hake called all of his data from the public records, adapting neutral presentational styles that resemble various contemporaneous projects in conceptual art. Sapolsky et al. Was to be part of the artist's solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in the spring of 1971, but the show was canceled 6 weeks before its scheduled opening. So what you can see here is he went out and he found the records of the buildings, okay, but then also a description of the paperwork that had to deal with these buildings. This text, again, it's typewritten sheets with different data on the property, such as the address, the type of building, the size of the lot, date of acquisition, and its owner, or assessed land value. So Hake synthesized these materials into diagrams revealing how the system was made up of obscure networks of family ties and dummy corporations. 2 maps of the Lower East Side and Harlem highlighting the lots owned by Sapolsky network complete the work. Okay, so this here you can see, this is the installation view, and you can see here, those are the texts we were just describing, and then a bunch of photographs that are associated with them. So in this way, what he was trying to call attention to was this idea of corruption, right? So like, if we think again about land, place, space, the place now being the slew of these apartment buildings, and how this particular family was operating in nefarious ways in order to acquire, rent out, and profit from these buildings. So this project, again, was supposed to take place within the Guggenheim in New York City. The title of the exhibition was supposed to be Solomon R. Guggenheim's Museum of Board of Trustees, and it would have mounted the index of the museum's corporate sponsorship and board of trustees on the wall of the museum. They weren't happy about this, and 6 weeks before the opening, the exhibition was canceled and the curator was fired. Okay, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, the Guggenheim is a major museum, and 6 weeks out to just say, hey, we're not going to have this exhibition is very, very unusual. But again, if we're thinking about this idea of institutional critique, he's compiling this data in order to speak about, maybe the invisible side of what's going on behind the museums. With Sapolsky, he's talking about the invisible side of what's happening with these apartment buildings. So like really, kind of like research heavy work, but I think speaks to another way of how you can get at this idea of land, place, and space. This is another installation view. This work has been shown many, many times. It's considered like a landmark work for institutional critique. So chances are, if you hear the name Hans Hake, you're going to hear about this work, and you have a good chance of seeing it if you're at a major museum. Maybe not in its entirety, but pieces of it. Moving on, I'm kind of moving away from photography just a little bit because I'm interested in you kind of getting a conceptual understanding when I think about place and space and land. And I'm going to look at the work of Richard Serra here. You may have seen his work, you may have not seen it. Um, but Richard Serra is a contemporary minimalist artist known for his monumental steel sculptures. Often daunting in scale, Serra's swooping architectural curves often provoke dizziness and disorientation as the viewer walks through their winding passage. So the work I'm going to show you here is called Tilted Arc. Um, and it's a 12-foot tall, 120-foot long, slightly tilted steel plate that ran through Manhattan's Federal Plaza. So you can see here, this is the work. This here is the piece, okay? And it's situated, if you look at an aerial view, here, kind of in the middle of this square. And it's kind of an eyesore. So, if you look at his sculptures, they're not pristine. They often looked as if they're rusted. They're very, very large, and this one in particular was taking up a lot of space. So what it did was, when it was installed in this Federal Plaza, the sculpture forced bypassers to take an absurd and inconvenient route to cross the plaza. By 1985, over 7,000 people, many of whom were employees in the surrounding buildings, had signed a petition for Tilted Arc's removal. Later that year, the jury sided with the petitioners. Okay, so it did eventually get removed. Okay, but I think this is a really interesting example of this idea of space, right? Like, this tilted arc is kind of literally dividing this space in half, right? And until now, I don't think, well, until this tilted arc was installed, people probably didn't think anything about the idea of an obstruction of a plaza, right? They probably just thought of it as a large concrete place where they had to cross. But now, with this tilted arc here, he's interrupting that space. Right? He's interrupting the normal interaction with the space. And so people are not happy about that. So I think conceptually it's interesting to think about, like, how do you disrupt space? And whose space is it, right? If you're not somebody who is walking by it every day and you're just there to appreciate it as a sculpture, it can be really interesting. But if you are the one who has to walk around this thing day after day and want to just make the most direct path from point A to point B, it becomes a hindrance. So that's the work of Richard Serra. And chances are, if you're paying attention to public sculpture, you'll probably see his work at some point. So moving on, we have the work of Mary Mattingly. Okay, so Mary Mattingly was born in 1978 in Rockville, Connecticut, and lives and works in New York City. Combining visual art practice with environmental activism and education, Mattingly wrote a manifesto that opens with the statement, "Art can transform people's perceptions about value, and collective art forms can reframe predominant ideologies." Mattingly's determination to create alternative means of survival in the face of dystopian futures has resulted in various projects, from wearable cocoons that can store water and solar power to alternative urban infrastructures, such as the Flock House Project 2012, for which she constructed portable living units that move throughout the New York City. So Mary Mattingly's work here, again, so not particularly photography per se, but the work tends to live within the photography realm because it is documented through photography or through video documentation. Okay, so this work, she's starting to think about like she's starting to think about her place in the world and kind of the things that she consumes, right? So she did this project, and I'll have a video of this linked within our Laulima page, where she documents all the things that she owns, and then also decides to see what it's like to have to physically deal with them um, in one moment. So here you see her working with all of her objects kind of made into this ball, and she's trying to move them through space, right? So she's talking about a lot of things, but I think with this work, she's particularly interested in these ideas of consumerism, um, waste, the impact of the human on the earth. All those things I think are like wrapped up within this body of work. And again, I have a video of her talking about this linked in Laulima, so I'll allow you to watch that to kind of see how she's thinking through these ideas. Next, we have Carrie Mae Weems. So we're going to move back now into the world of photography. So Carrie Mae Weems was born in Portland, Oregon in 1953. And, she's a pretty important photographer. One of the first photographers of color that was widely accepted by the art world. And she's still working today. So a little bit about her work. Weems' vibrant exploration of photography, video, and verse breathed new life into traditional narrative forms. Social documentary, tableau, self-portrait, and oral history, eliciting epic contexts from individual framed moments. Weems debunks racist and sexist labels, examining the relationship between power and aesthetics, and uses personal biographies to articulate broader truths. Whether adapting or appropriating archival images, restaging famous new photographs, or creating altogether new scenes, she traces an indirect history of the depiction of African Americans for more than a century. So the body of work that I'm going to show you is from her kitchen table series. And in this, the artist kind of has little vignettes where she has different interactions between her family around her, all playing out on this kitchen table. So the compositions are very similar. So we're kind of moving away from the exterior a little bit and like coming into the interior, into the home, thinking about ideas of domesticity, of representation of the family, and particularly with Carrie Mae Weems, these ideas of blackness in America. So this image here is from 1990. It's untitled, and it's Untitled Woman Brushing Hair. And I think the images kind of speak for themselves, so I'm not going to talk too much over them. I'll give you context for the titles. And these are all going to be untitled something, and this one is Untitled Woman and Daughter with Makeup. Untitled Eating Lobster, 1990. Untitled Woman Playing Solitaire. Untitled Woman Standing Alone. So like this work I think is pretty important work. And a lot of the work she does I think created space for photographers of color to exist within the contemporary canon of art. So I mean, this is just an excerpt from one of her projects. I highly encourage you all to look at her work. She's still out there making work, and she's still a pretty important figure within the arts. So please take the time to look at Carrie Mae Weems' work. Next, we have Sally Mann. And Sally Mann is a photographer working, I believe she lives out in Virginia, in the South, and she did a number of different projects throughout her time as a photographer, and I believe is still active today. But what she's kind of most famous for is her project dealing with the documentation of her family. Um, and I think I showed some of her, one or two of her images in one of our other lectures. But here, this is from her body of work called Family Pictures, where she was documenting the ranch that she lived on and how her children interacted with that particular ranch. Okay, so again, we're looking at these ideas of domesticity, this time from a slightly different angle. But here, people were kind of up in arms when this work came out because uh, she was photographing her children in ways that were largely unconventional. So, like this one, for example, we have her daughter addressing the camera with a cigarette in her hand, albeit that the cigarette is a stick of gum. Okay, so it's not a real cigarette. But people weren't used to seeing children in this way, and what Mann says is that these images are not anything outside of the ordinary of what her children would be doing on an everyday basis. She just happened to have her camera present, and because she's a really astute photographer, whenever her children were engaging in these behaviors, she would ask them to stop, take out her camera, and then make the picture. So this idea being that this is nothing out of the ordinary, it's just that she took the time to capture these images with her camera. Um, and again, people were not happy about this work. You know, they accused her of child pornography, of exploiting her children. And if you listen to her talk about her work, Mann is adamant about the fact that these were her children being children. They lived on a large ranch where her children were much more comfortable without clothes on, and she even reminisces about her childhood when she was the same way, being somebody who was slightly rebellious, wasn't comfortable wearing clothes, and so she just allowed her children to act in the manner that they wanted to. But you know, these photographs, regardless of how you feel about their content, I mean, I think they function very much in the manner of Ansel Adams photographs. If you think back to the beginning of our lecture, I mean, they're all quite lovely. They're beautifully framed and composed, beautifully printed. The tonal ranges on them are quite long, from rich, rich blacks to like vibrant whites. And just very tender moments, right? Albeit it encourages you to look a lot deeper. I mean, this image right here of her daughter with whatever this thing is around her torso, seemingly calm, but maybe in the aftermath of a tantrum, and that also being maybe hinted to by these teeth marks on her mother's arm, right? This is her son and her husband. I mean, these images are extremely loving. Look at this gesture here with the two pinkies wrapped around each other. This is actually from a bug bite. Swollen eye from a bug bite. People accused of Sally Mann of being romantic, kind of romanticizing in not only the way that she prints, but also in her depiction of her subject matter. I don't know if that's present here with her children, but sometimes with her landscape work, that question comes up. So this body of water was very close to their home. Okay, so that's the work of Sally Mann. Next we have Rineke Dijkstra. She's a contemporary Dutch photographer. She's known for her single portraits, usually working in a series, often focusing on particular groups or communities of people, such as mothers, adolescents, and teenage boys and girls, soldiers, etc., with an emphasis on capturing the vulnerable side of her subjects. She says, quote, "With young people, everything is much more on the surface, all the emotions. When you get older, you know how to hide things." So the images I'm going to show you are from a series where she was photographing adolescent boys and girls on the beach. And again, she is hinting at the awkwardness of being at that age, right? I think all of us have gone through this. We're not necessarily comfortable in our bodies. We don't really know how to hold ourselves or conduct ourselves, or maybe we do, and we're just starting to discover that. And by photographing, these adolescents at this age with their bathing suits on, it adds another layer of like the revealing of the body, of just how awkward the body can be at this age. And I should say that this is probably happening in Europe because she's a Dutch photographer. But what's interesting again is just it's a formulaic thing, right? If you think back to Sugimoto's work, the place being the beach, right? But the variations in where the camera is set when the photograph is made, and then also the pose and the stance of the sitter really adds to our interpretation of the photograph. And I believe that she, not really asking them to pose in any particular fashion, she's probably allowing them to act as natural, quote unquote, as possible in front of the camera. But notice also where the camera lens is, right? It's probably lined up with their midsection. So she's photographing slightly up at them, and she's giving them power by doing that, right? I get the sense that out of all these pictures, these sets of boys feel like the most comfortable in their own skin. Moving on, we have Collier Shore. So Collier Shore is a contemporary American photographer whose work negotiates how identity is formed. Her photographs often feature costumes, props, and iconic images to further her attempts at producing unique images. So this body of work I'm going to show you is kind of building upon the work we just looked at. And it's of a slightly older group of kids, but now she's looking at these wrestlers in a high school. So in this body of work, Shore is comparing the way men and women pose differently for the artist's gaze. In her photographs of American high schoolers and collegiate wrestlers, the artist trains her camera on a tribe of young men whose bodies and athletic training homogenizes personal difference. So she's photographing these again in a very particular method. She's using a strobe. She's photographing inside. And I think the strobe, what it's doing is it's kind of causing a lot of drama to happen. With the bodies popping out of the black background, we're becoming more aware of their gestures, the muscles, how they're treating the objects they're interacting with. And in some ways, she's kind of abstracting them. So again, thinking back to this idea of land, place, space, with this one, she is kind of only giving reference to place or even space. It's providing some context, but she's more interested in how these bodies become very similar based on the activity or based on the thing that they're taking part in. So in some ways, it doesn't matter that this is all happening in a gym. So that's a work of Collier Shore. And finally, we're going to end here on Paul Mpagi Sepoya. So a little bit about his work. With his highly constructed studio portraiture, Sepoya blends the conceptual approach to his photography with a warm examination of his own queer community. The artist uses mirrors, drapes, and collage to manipulate perspectives throughout his frames. He subverts compositional traditions, particularly regarding the self-portrait and the male nude. Sepoya blurs the boundaries between reality and illusion, and between photographer and subject. He captures models, friends, lovers, and himself in the studio. He transforms the space into a site of community, revelation, and experiments with both the erotic and the aesthetic. So I wanted to end here because we kind of moved through the landscape into a more narrow view of particular parts of the landscape, and then we moved into the home, and now we're kind of moving into these public interior spaces, one kind of being the gym, and now we're kind of in the artist studio. And this work, you know, it's building on these traditions of portraiture, but it's also speaking about these ideas of abstraction, of identity via fragmentation, of self-reflection. Okay, so what he's doing is he's using this mirror to make all of his images, and then using different parts of the body, and also his camera equipment to speak to these ideas of queerness, of representation through portraiture, of desire. And just like some of the other artists, I have a video that accompanies Sepoya's work. So I encourage you to watch that video when this lecture concludes. But here he's using the same mirror, and he's obscuring the view of the body with different objects. In this case, it looks like a brown blanket of some sort that has a hole cut out of it. Sometimes the body is more recognizable than in other ones. Other times you have fragmentation or multiple bodies. Here you can see the use of not only the mirror, the tripod, but then also of different prints from the artist's previous work. Okay, so again, this idea of fragmentation to speak to notions of identity. The last slide is going to be the video that I've linked to Arlau Lima, but I'm going to end it here. So I hope that gives you context about how you should be thinking about place, land, and space for this particular project. And I also hope you enjoyed this lecture and can take something away from the photographers and artists that were talked about today. So with that, I'm going to end the video here, and I'll see you all in the next one.